Hey everybody, today I'm out here in the forest and this big truck right next to me is the Ram 2500. Ram recently gave their half-ton 1500 pickup truck a complete clean sheet redesign. But for the 2500 and 3500, Ram did something a little bit different and gave this a very significant refresh. There's a lot of controversy about whether this is a redesign or not. Ram, of course, calls it a redesign, but there are large portions of the 2500 and 3500 that are shared with the previous generation. And that's why personally I'm a little bit less excited about the 2500 and 3500 for 2019 than I am about the Ram 1500. The 1500 is, in my estimation, quite simply the best half-ton truck in America. With the 2500 and 3500, these are obviously very compelling trucks, but I think there are also some really good reasons that you might want to take a look at the competition. No modern heavy-duty truck would be complete without an enormous grille on the front, and that's certainly what we find in the Ram 2500. This is not just aesthetic, however, this is functional, because in order to tow the kind of weights you can tow in the 2500 and 3500, and in order to cool a massive diesel engine that can produce up to 1,000 pound-feet of torque, you need an enormous grille opening so you can have an enormous radiator behind it. So that's what's going on right here. The overall style changes depending on the different trims that you get. This particular trim is one of the top-end models. It's the Laramie Longhorn version. It's the one with the really great interior that we're going to see in just a bit. It also has a decent amount of chrome and then a body color painted metal bumper that helps dress things up a little bit. It's not quite as flashy as if it had a chrome bumper, but it's still quite functional because we have that metal bumper, front parking sensors, big tow hooks right there as well. We also have full LED headlamps in this model. Ram decided to send me the longest version of the Ram 2500. This one comes in at over 260 inches or over 6.5 meters if you're watching this in Europe. This is an 8-foot bed in the back and the crew cab. This is not the biggest cab available in the heavy-duty trucks. You can get a mega cab. The mega cab uses basically the same sort of stuff going on right there and then adds a few inches right back here behind the rear doors. However, the mega cab cannot be combined with the 8-foot bed because that would create a truck that is absolutely ridiculous even for American roadways. This is very, very long, and the length and the overall size of the vehicle means that it doesn't turn terribly sharply. This has a turning diameter of around 54 feet or so. Definitely a lot larger than the average minivan or crossover in America. Out back we find pretty typical pickup truck styling with the exception of these amber turn signals, which is definitely my preference. These lamp modules also contain the blind spot sensors for the Ram 2500. However, these do not interact with trailers. These will just tell you about the blind spot of the truck itself. I think that's a little bit of a pity because when we're talking about a truck that's this big, it really would be handy if we had some of the newer blind spot monitoring systems that also did trailer detection and could tell you what's in the blind spot of the trailer itself. Under this hood, we find evolution rather than revolution for 2019. The base engine is a 6.4-liter Hemi. We've seen that from FCA for a while, and it's mated to an 8-speed automatic transmission. Again, we've seen that from them in other vehicles for a while too, but we'll now find those in base 2500 and 3500 models. Then we have this engine right here. It's the 6.7-liter Cummins turbo diesel engine. Again, very familiar, but this one has been reworked in order to give us more power and more torque for 2019. The 2500 gets the version that we're driving right here, 370 horsepower and 850 pound-feet of torque standard, and it's mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission that's made by FCA themselves. It's the 68 RFE transmission. If you get the Ram 3500, then you can get the same engine and transmission, or you can get a version that produces 400 horsepower and a whopping 1,000 pound-feet of torque. The way they get away with that is that they trade out the transmission, which can't handle that much torque, and they swap in an Ison 6-speed automatic transmission that was originally designed for medium-duty trucks. I know that sounds odd because this is a heavy-duty pickup truck, but a medium-duty truck is actually several steps above this in terms of overall capability. When properly equipped, you can get the payload rating of your 2500 up to over 4,000 pounds, which theoretically would mean that you could put this mini excavator right there in the bed. Admittedly, I would have to take off the blade and the bucket, and I wouldn't be able to drive anywhere because payload also includes the driver and passengers, so that 4,000 pounds of payload would be just about right for this particular excavator, but that gives you an idea of what kind of payload you can do with 4,000 pounds. And now let's talk about towing, theoretically what 3/4 ton and 1 ton trucks are all about. I'll let you reference that chart on the side of your screen for those towing figures, but as you can see, towing numbers for the 2500 and 3500 are positively insane. The numbers on the side of your screen are so insane, the reality is that most of us in the United States with a traditional Class C license, which is what allows us to drive a car, a truck, a camper trailer, etc., just can't tow those kind of loads. Towing laws and regulations vary greatly from state to state, so be sure and check with your state before you try to pull some of those large maximum loads in the 2500, 3500, or any other big truck in America. Towing regulations in some states are pretty clear and easy to understand. So for instance, here in California, 10,000 pounds conventional is the maximum you can tow. If you were to use a fifth wheel or a gooseneck, you could step it up to 15,000 pounds, period, regardless of what you're towing or what you're towing with. Anything beyond that, you need a Class A license in California. California does, however, offer a non-commercial Class A category that's a little bit easier to deal with than the traditional commercial Class A. But not every state out there offers a non-commercial form of that license that would allow you to tow the maximum loads in the 2500 and 3500. Unfortunately, some states out there base their regulations not just on what you're towing, but what you're towing with. They use combined weight ratings, and this list is not limited to, but includes Kansas, Massachusetts, North Carolina, New Hampshire, New Mexico, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Wyoming, and most importantly, Texas. Those go by combined weight ratings, 26,000 pounds maximum for a Class C. The Ram 2500 here could go up to 14,000 pounds GVWR. So if you do the math, that would mean that you'd only be able to tow 12,000 pounds with your 2500 and be in compliance with the law. For those counting, that's 3,000 pounds less than you could tow a fifth wheel or a gooseneck with this in California. Now, making things even more complicated, Texas does offer an agricultural exemption that will let you go way beyond the limit if you have a fifth wheel and you're doing agricultural towing. So cattle, hay, something along those lines, you can go well over your regular limit in Texas. But if you got a big RV, a fifth wheel, something along those lines, a really big boat, then it would have to be within compliance in the normal statutes there in Texas. So again, be sure and check your state laws before you try and tow 35,000 pounds with your brand new truck. In most cases, you won't legally be able to tow that, and the fine can be very hefty. In Texas and California, for instance, both states will treat that violation as if you were driving without a license. As you probably know by now, I love air suspensions, whether we're talking about the full air suspension in the Ram 1500 or this partial air suspension in the Ram 2500. Right now, I have the rear air suspension at its standard height. You can see I have the trailer appropriately adjusted there, but what if I didn't? What if I wanted to make this a little bit easier? Well, I could just hit the bed lowering button right there in the cab, hop out, and as you can see, the truck will lower down even further. You can really see how much of a difference we get here. It's about a 2-inch drop or so. So if you're in a tight situation or you just don't want to crank your trailer down that much, this definitely could be a little bit of an assistance. It also makes it a little bit easier to get goosenecks on and off. When creating the 2019 heavy-duty series of trucks, Ram didn't just take the complete interior from the 1500 and transplant it here into the 2500. There are still remnants of the previous generation of Ram 2500 here, and one of those things is the front seat frames. And that's why we don't find 4-way adjustable lumbar support in the Ram 2500, and the seat overall is not as comfortable as what we see in the new Ram 1500. Personally, I think that's a little bit of a pity. I really wish that they'd spent a little bit of extra time and transplanted the modern seat design here into the heavy-duty trucks, because overall front seat comfort falls a little bit behind some of the competition, especially the Ford F-250 and F-350. Now, as with any big truck in America, overall front seat room is definitely excellent. We have the sunroof in this model. I still have several inches of headroom left. There's an awful lot of legroom going on in here, but another remnant of the previous generation Ram 2500 and 3500 is that we don't have a telescopic steering column. This just adjusts for tilt. Again, very much like the front seats, we have an awful lot of room back here, and that's definitely a hallmark of a big American pickup truck. The front seats are very thickly padded, they're very, very deep, and as you can see, I still have about 8 or 9 inches of legroom left. Headroom is a little bit more limited than I would like, however. That is one of the benefits of the Mega Cab. It all has to do with the roof shape right back here. Remember that the cab sheet metal remains the same as the last generation model, so overall interior dimensions are very, very similar to that model. And as you can see, the ceiling definitely dishes down right here. It's about the same level as this door opening. And it also curves towards the back to meet that rear window. That means that I can't really put my head against the rear headrest. Instead, my head touches the back part of the ceiling. But if I were to sit in a more normal position rather than trying to lean all the way back, then there is definitely about an inch of headroom left. There's also a lot of width, so if I move over here to the middle seat, you could definitely put an adult back here with absolutely no problem. And scooting all the way over to the right side with this front seat back in its tracks, you can see I still have about 5 inches of legroom left. There's some storage under the seats. We simply fold the seat bottom cushion upright like that. It latches into place. We can then lift this lid and get access to a small storage area. Again, not as big as what we find in the Ram 1500. And then we can fold this over right like that if we want a flatter load floor right back here. Again, this is another feature that is not quite as modern, not quite as intuitive as what we find in the Ram 1500, but still definitely handy. You might be wondering, why didn't Ram give the 2500 and 3500 new cabs for this generation? Obviously, cost was definitely a factor because they were able to give this a new interior and keep the sheet metal, which is quite expensive to produce and design. But the other reason is that these cabs were already large for the segment. So the Ram 2500 and Ram 3500 still compare very well to the Silverado, the Sierra, and of course the Ford F250 and F350. As we look around the cabin, keep in mind that we are in one of the upper end trims, the Laramie Longhorn edition. We have this pretty standard sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. Height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, four-way adjustable headrests as well. And from this angle you can see that the rear shoulder belts do not adjust for height. As with the Ram 1500, there are a lot of different leather colors and textures going on here, but I do find the look overall harmonious. We have the Laramie Longhorn badge embossed right there in the leather. The center of the seats is perforated because these front seats are both heated and ventilated, and you can see that the back of the seat and the sides are charcoal leather. Moving over to the front doors, we find another remnant of the previous generation HD trucks. This is basically the same door design that we found in the 2018 trucks, although you can see that it's been restyled with materials that match what's going on in this interior. So the real wood trim right there, the sort of alligator themed embossed leather, but the overall shapes and size and position of everything is very in keeping with the last generation truck. Moving from the doors on over to the dashboard, you can see that Ram did a good job overall integrating those previous elements with the current design elements borrowed from the Ram 1500. But even so, I wish they had borrowed a few more elements from the Ram 1500's interior other than just the major dashboard components. You'll see right here in the dashboard that this is exactly the same style as we find in the half-ton truck design. We have the split glove box here, so one up here behind that roller door. It's a very large storage compartment, definitely able to accommodate those larger smartphones there. And then below that, we have a smallish bin-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a big tablet computer inside there. As we continue on over to the dashboard, you'll notice that this is essentially the same as the Ram 1500, including this new ginormous LCD infotainment system. There's a bit of a storage cubby right up there at the top. We also have a 12-volt power port and the center channel speaker right there at the top of the dash. This is the largest LCD infotainment system that you'll find in any modern pickup truck, but it's only available in the very top-end trims of the 2500 and 3500. You'll notice that there are a few things missing here versus the Ram 1500, however. There's no autonomous parking button right up here along the top, although we still have a lot of physical buttons to make it easier to access certain features if you're wearing gloves. For instance, we have a power and volume knob over here, tune knob over here, and we can adjust the temperature physically without using the touchscreen right there in the middle. We do have access to all of our Sirius Travel Link features here, however, and the screen is very crisp, very high resolution, very easy to use. The bottom controls are customizable, so for instance, if I wanted to lower the bed right there thanks to the air suspension, I can program a quick one-touch option right there. Continuing down the dashboard, we still have a column shifter, so no shifter knob right over here in this area. Instead, we just find the four-wheel drive controls. We then have the integrated trailer brake controller, the alternate trailer height option that lowers the suspension to make it easier to connect or disconnect a trailer. This is the exhaust brake enable disable button, tow haul mode. We have buttons to turn on and off the rear and front parking sensors independently of one another. And then as we continue on down, we have 4 USB inputs and an auxiliary input, 2 USB-Cs, and then 2 regular USB inputs. There's an area where you can store your smartphone right there by the wireless charger, and then there's a single slot optical displayer hidden right behind that area. The center console is also common with the Ram 1500s. This has their newer design where we have cup holders right there under that flap, a large storage area right there under that flap, along with some coin holders. And then this entire section slides forward and backward. And then behind that we have a padded armrest. You can see the 2 cup holders for the rear passengers there. If I lift this lid, then we get a separated storage area where we have one shallow area right here. USB charge port right back there is a nice touch. If I lift that again, we find another large storage area right there. There's a max fill line indicating what you can put here and still have this glide forward and backward. Fortunately, FCA already had one of the more attractive partial LCD instrument clusters. This is definitely fully featured. We have a lot of different trailer information going on here, media information, vehicle messages. You can adjust certain screen settings. This relates just to this particular screen. There's also a big digital speedometer and a number of different gauges that you can see here. The steering wheel and steering column are also common with the previous generation truck, although again, you can see this has been updated so we get the real wood on top, little accent right down there below. But the buttons in the shape of the airbag cover are definitely the last generation Ram 2500. These buttons over here refer to that multifunction LCD right there between the speedometer and tachometer, voice command button and phone button. And then on the right side of the steering wheel, we have the buttons for the radar adaptive cruise control. You'll notice there are no infotainment buttons on the front of the steering wheel. They still put those on the back, so volume up, down on the right, track up, down over there on the left, and then we have the gear limit buttons right here. This is not a manual mode, but this will limit what gears the transmission will use. In our 0 to 60 tests, obviously without the trailer connected back there, we went 0 to 60 in 7.4 seconds. But if you have a trailer like that connected to the 2500, you're not going to notice a huge difference in acceleration because this thing drives almost like that 7,500 pound trailer isn't there at all. That's obviously thanks to the 850 pound-feet of torque that we get out of this engine. I am a little bit sad that we can't get the Aisin automatic transmission here in the Ram 2500 or a more modern 8-speed automatic transmission in the 2500 with the diesel. The main reason for that is that the gear ratios in the 68 RFE transmission are a little bit unusual. They're not as evenly spaced as we see, for instance, in the ZF 8-speed with the 6.4-liter Hemi engine. Now, the most likely reason that we don't see the 8-speed automatic transmission here is that it wasn't designed for the kind of torque that this engine can provide, but I have to think that ZF and FCA could have worked together to create a version of that 8-speed that could handle the power. The 6-speed automatic transmission could be seen as a little bit of a disadvantage for the Ram 2500 and 3500 versus the new Silverado and the upcoming F250 and F350 because those are all getting a new 10-speed automatic transmission. Ford calls theirs an in-house design, Chevy is calling theirs an Allison transmission. Doesn't really matter what you want to call it. Those transmissions have the same common root. It's the Ford General Motors transmission that we see in the rest of the Silverado and Ford lineup. For the heavy-duty pickup truck line, it was re-engineered by Ford and re-engineered respectively by General Motors in order to adapt them to the Silverado and the F-Truck lineup. The big thing with those 10-speed automatic transmissions is that they have wider ratio spreads and gears that are closer together than we find in this 68 RFE or in the Aisin transmission available in the 3500. And that really is going to help improve diesel towing. Remember that diesel engines don't have a very broad RPM spread. This engine idles just under 1,000 RPM and redlines just over 3,000 RPM, so there's not a whole lot of room to work with there. The closer your ratios are together, the more likely you are to find a good ratio for whatever it is you're trying to do. And then the wider the ratio spread, the more efficient things are going to be when you're towing out on the highway. But let's get back to the Ram truck. It took 139 feet to go from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in our braking test. That's definitely on the long side in general for pickup trucks, but right where the average heavy-duty truck is going to be. Obviously, heavy-duty brakes are required in order to be able to tow these heavy loads because you have to be able to stop them. So the braking is not an issue, it's just the overall weight of this truck. It's a big, heavy truck. This vehicle weighs over 7,000 pounds, so it's going to take a while to get it to stop. When it comes to overall handling, I'm going to give this either an A or a question mark depending on how you want to look at it. This definitely handles well for a heavy-duty truck, so I think I like the handling ability and the handling feel overall better than the Silverado 2500 or the F250, but this is not going to handle like a Ram 1500. You definitely have to give up an awful lot of on-road civility in order to get the capability that we find in this truck. It's higher off the ground, the center of gravity is higher off the ground, it definitely is a lot heavier with that turbo diesel engine under the hood, and the suspension design isn't quite as on-road focused as what we see in the Ram 1500. That's all to support the high payload and high towing abilities that we see in this model. Out on a rougher road like this, you'll immediately notice the difference between a half-ton truck, a three-quarter-ton truck, and a one-ton truck. The higher the payload ability, the stiffer the springs in the back, and the poorer the ride becomes, especially when not laden very much. Now, right at the moment, we have probably about 1,500 pounds on the tongue or so. That's thanks to that trailer back there and, of course, the excavator, and that really is helping improve the ride. But this 2500 has another trick up its sleeve. It has a suspension that is, I suppose you could say, a cross between the Ram 1500 and the Ram 3500. We get a rear load leveling air suspension in the back, and that's pretty unique in this segment. That helps FCA put slightly softer springs in the rear to give you a slightly better ride, but still give you that extra payload ability. It also allows the rear suspension to return to an optimum state of travel to give you better handling dynamics when you have a lot of weight in the bed or a lot of weight back there on the tongue. A lot of folks don't realize this, but if you've really overloaded your suspension and the suspension travels all the way down there at the bottom or at the top, depending on how you want to look at it, you're not going to get great suspension dynamics. In fact, you're really going to hurt your overall handling ability, especially emergency maneuvers. An air suspension like this one will pump things back up, return the suspension to the middle of its travel, and really improve those emergency handling dynamics. We also have a suspension design in the Ram 2500 that I suppose you could say is a little bit more adventurous, and that really does help improve on-road handling. But as anybody that has a heavy-duty truck will tell you, the ride definitely gets bouncy over some of these larger imperfections. A Ram 1500 would handle these just about as well, and it would of course be a little bit softer in the process. Now, as we round this corner right here, you'll notice one of the other things you'll notice immediately about a large heavy-duty truck like this, and that is the turning circle. This does not turn terribly tightly. The turning diameter in this vehicle is 54 feet, which is absolutely enormous. And that means that navigating a 20-foot trailer like that one right back there with this truck in front of it can get a little bit tricky. Definitely trickier than driving that same trailer with a shorter 1500 series truck. Back out on the highway, you'll definitely notice the firm suspension out here as well. Again, especially if the bed does not have as much weight as we have on it right now. Right now we have about the maximum payload overall in the 2500, and that's why this is riding a lot nicer. At 50 miles an hour, we measured 69 decibels in this cabin, which is incredibly quiet, especially considering we have that big diesel engine under the hood. Obviously, under full throttle acceleration or even part throttle acceleration, you're going to get more noise into the cabin, but when you're just out cruising on the highway, this is a very, very quiet cabin. And that's definitely something that we've seen in the rest of the Ram truck lineup as well, especially that brand new 1500. A quiet cabin is not a hallmark of just the Ram truck lineup, however. We do find very quiet cabins in the Chevy trucks, GMC trucks, and Ford trucks just due to the overall design of a pickup truck. This is a body-on-frame vehicle, so the frame where that trailer is resting and the engine, etc., that is separate from the body, which is where I'm sitting. Overall fuel economy is a little bit hard to talk about, A, because trucks like this are not required to have an EPA rating, and B, because the use case varies so much from person to person. If you're doing a lot of hauling in the bed, a lot of towing, your fuel economy is obviously going to be lower. There's also going to be a pretty big difference between just hauling heavy loads and towing a big trailer, depending on the design of your trailer. But we've been averaging 15.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, which is overall pretty darn good considering how big this vehicle is and how big that engine is.
It's really hard to talk about the Ram 2500 without also talking about the Ram 3500, and here's where pricing and options get a little bit tricky because there are so many different ways you can configure your Ram heavy-duty truck. That's why you don't see the normal pricing chart up here on your screen. Key things to know is that the Ram 2500 starts out at $33,645. That's a pretty reasonable price for a 3/4 ton pickup truck in America. But if you want the diesel engine, that's a big expense. That's $9,100 for the model with 850 pound-feet of torque. If you want the Big Daddy diesel with 1,000 pound-feet of torque, you have to step up into the Ram 3500. That's $35,095, and then you have to add $11,795 because the transmission that allows you to get that 1,000 pound-feet of torque is more expensive than what we see in the Ram 2500. A nice touch that we see in the Ram lineup that we don't necessarily see in the competition is that Ram allows a lot of towing targeted features to be had in even the very base trim of the 2500 and 3500. So if you want the diesel engine, if you want the air suspension, etc., you can get those in even that base model. And the air suspension is definitely something that I would get in the 2500 and 3500 if you plan on either towing heavy weights or putting a lot of payload in the bed, because it really is going to improve the overall driving nature of the pickup truck out on the road. With that out of the way, let's talk about the big three entries here. And for purposes of comparison, I'm combining the Chevy Silverado and the GMC Sierra HD because they're essentially identical. We will have a first drive review of the GMC HD trucks coming up very soon. It should be about a week or two after you see this video, so be sure and stay tuned for that. We will have the Ford pickup truck line just as soon as we can get our hands on it. There are a lot of details that we don't know specifically about the Ford line, so keep that in mind as we start rolling through these charts here. Some of these are going to be estimated numbers, and some of these numbers will be for the 2019 Ford heavy-duty series of pickup trucks because we don't know what 2020 is going to bring. But the big thing here is that for 2019 and 2020, between these two model years, we are going to see the significantly refreshed Ram 2500 and 3500, the all-new Silverado 2500 and 3500, and the significantly refreshed Ford F-250, 350, and 450. Knowing Ford, there are probably going to be some additional changes perhaps for 2021. We don't have too much visibility on that just yet. Since trucks in this segment are logically all about numbers, let's take a look at our first chart here. You can see that at the moment, the Ram 2500 and 3500 post some very good towing numbers, just barely beaten out in some areas by the new Silverado trucks. But honestly, we're talking about a difference of only a few hundred pounds. And when we're talking about 35,000 pounds and the difference between 35,100, 35,500, 35,300, etc., we're not talking about a big deal here. Indeed, all of these trucks will tow some truly impressive amounts. The heavy-duty truck segment really is an area where we see a lot of one-upsmanship going on. So when Ram came out with their new 2500 and 3500, they said, we are class leading. Then Chevy said, hey, hold my beer, and gave us a few hundred pounds extra towing ability on top of what we saw in the Ram truck lineup. So I expect that Ford is going to be doing the same thing with the F250, F350, and F450. But as you can see, a lot of these numbers are very, very high, and as we said earlier in this video, remember that not a lot of folks out there in America can really legally tow these amounts. Instead, for a lot of folks out there, payload figures may be a little bit more important. Here's where I should make a disclaimer that although you can see that the Ram does list very high payload figures here on this screen, these are maximum payload figures, and generally speaking, as we see in some of Ram's other pickup trucks, comparably configured, the Ram trucks may be a little bit below what we see in the Chevy, and especially the Ford. The big thing we see in the new Super Duty lineup, however, is really their engine lineup. There are going to be 3 different engines for the F250 and F350. We're going to get the 6.2-liter V8 standard that we have seen for a while, 385 horsepower, 400 pound-feet of torque, and the same old 6-speed automatic transmission. If you're looking at base engine and transmission combinations, there really is going to be a benefit to the Ram 2500 with the new 8-speed automatic transmission on that gasoline engine. The Silverado gets an all-new 6.6-liter V8, producing just over 400 horsepower and a pretty decent amount of torque, but it also has an older 6-speed automatic transmission. I'm really intrigued by Ford's new big gas engine because logically it should be giving you better than base performance when we're talking about the base V8 engines, including the one that we find in the Ram, but probably at a lower MSRP than any of the optional diesel engines we see in this segment. Now, we don't know for sure because we don't have official pricing details just yet. But the big deal we see in the GM and in the Ford pickup trucks is that their Big Daddy diesel engines come standard with the 10-speed automatic transmission. The big deal there is that transmission is designed to handle more torque than we see in the base transmission in the Ram truck line. So if you get a Silverado 2500 or an F250 with the diesel engine, it's going to be a bit more powerful than the engine that we see in the Ram 2500. Before we dive into pros and cons, again, you should keep in mind that there are so many different ways that you can configure your truck. You need to keep all these different variations in mind. So it's really easy to fall into the rabbit hole of going to a dealer, seeing one F250 on the lot or an F350 on the lot, comparing that to a Silverado on the lot and a Ram on the lot, and say, well, I like option A because it has a higher GVWR, or it has a higher payload capacity, or a higher towing capacity on the door sticker or on the window label. But you're not necessarily looking at an apples-to-apples comparison. Just look at this Ford chart right here about all the different ways that you can get just your F250. Then there's another chart like this for the F350 single rear wheel, the dually F350, then the F450 as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that Ford handles their heavy-duty truck lineup a little bit differently than the others. There's an F250, an F350, and an F450, and you can't really have a conversation about heavy-duty trucks without talking about all 3 Ford models. Here's how it splits up. Ford has put the towing-focused heavy-duty models separate from the max payload model. So the F350 is the max payload model. That's the one focused on over 7,000 pounds of payload, whereas the F450 is the vehicle that you want to get if you're going to be towing those really heavy fifth wheel or gooseneck loads over 35,000 pounds. That's what that model is targeted for. So moving along, let's talk about the Ford pros and cons here. Biggest pro, I think, in the new Super Duty lineup is the fact that we're going to be seeing that 10-speed automatic transmission on more engine combinations. It's going to be on the 7.3-liter V8, and it's going to be on the diesel engine. And if you're planning on getting a diesel in this segment, that's going to be a big, big deal. Diesel engines have very narrow power bands, so the more gears you can give the engine, the better off you're going to be, especially if you can really broaden that ratio spread at the same time. That's going to improve towing performance, it's also going to improve drivability, and it's likely going to have an impact on your fuel consumption as well. Ford also gives us relatively high payload figures. I expect that's going to continue for the new 2020 model. We don't see any reason that that might change. And Ford also gives us more ways to configure. That's quite logical because Ford seems to sell more trucks than the rest of the competition. When it comes to towing features, we get Ford's backup assist system, borrowed from the F-150, that makes it a little bit easier to back up some of those larger trailers, especially in limited visibility situations. And we have a blind spot monitoring system that is adaptable to trailers. So as long as the load isn't over about 8 feet 5 wide, the monitoring system will automatically detect that the trailer is there and tell you what's in the blind spot of the truck and what's in the blind spot of the trailer. Interestingly enough, this is similar to what we see in the Ram 1500, but we don't get that same feature yet in the Ram heavy-duty truck line. We don't really know why. I think the biggest win for the Silverado and Sierra HD is the new GM trailering app that we see there. It's a series of apps on the head unit and that can be connected via a phone. They help you connect your trailer up, help you test your lighting, and then, of course, they're all the different camera inputs we see in that system. So you can see around your trailer, you can see even inside your trailer, and then there's some views where it can calculate an ability to see through the trailer. So there's a camera on the back of the trailer, a camera on the back of the truck. It combines the images together to make it look like the trailer isn't even there as you're driving along. Having all those camera inputs in the GM truck lineup really makes it easier to back up a trailer and see what's really going on with the trailer as well. Those are features that I really love because theoretically heavy-duty trucks are all about towing, and these are features that are definitely very targeted at someone that tows frequently. On the downside, the GM trucks don't have adaptive cruise control just yet. GM has implied that it's coming, but right now at launch, you won't find adaptive cruise control for some reason in the Silverado or in the Sierra. Not really sure why that is, since we do see it in the Ford truck lineup, and then of course in the Ram truck lineup as well. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The Ram 1500 is quite simply the best half-ton pickup truck in America. Rather unfortunately, I don't think the same clear win is here for the Ram 2500 and Ram 3500. There are clearly some areas where the Ram excels over the competition, mostly interior refinement, referring to the dashboard styling, the dashboard parts quality, etc., and of course that big infotainment screen in the dashboard. But unfortunately, the fact that the 2500 and 3500 were not a complete clean sheet redesign, that's left a few things behind. Front seat comfort is definitely one of them. We don't find seats that are as comfortable as the new Silverado, the Sierra, or the Ford pickup truck line, or even Ram's own 1500. I was really disappointed by that. There are also some comfort features that are missing that we do see in either the competition or in Ram's own half-ton truck, like four-way adjustable lumbar support and a tilt telescopic steering column. But on the other hand, the Ram truck lineup is very well priced. I think that does compensate for some of this. And we have the availability of the air suspensions, which I do think is a really novel entry in this segment and very important for people that are going to be towing a lot of heavy loads or putting a lot of payload in the back of their trucks. It's really going to help improve the overall handling dynamics, especially in emergency maneuvers. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below, and let me know what you would pick in this segment if you were shopping for either a 3/4 ton truck or a 1-ton truck. I have to say that at this exact moment, if I were shopping for one, I would be pretty tempted by the new diesel in the Sierra. The interior is not as nice as the interior in the Ram 2500, but it is a little bit more comfortable, and I really like those very towing-focused features in the Sierra and the Silverado. I would also be tempted to possibly wait for the Ford F250 or F350, because we are going to be seeing some of those same Ford luxury options, like the massaging seats available. Definitely makes it very comfortable for long trips in that model. And we're going to be seeing the 10-speed automatic transmission with the new gasoline engine, which could be a really interesting value play in this segment. Again, let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below, and I'll see you later.